Mao's going to be somebody who's going to be, his name is going to be talked about for centuries moving forward because of his political vision, his action. He went from organizing a small communist group of 20 people in the basement of a women's college to now having not only the largest communist party in the world, but the largest political party in the world that is in the largest populated country in the world, leading the fastest industrialization, lifting more people out of poverty than ever in human history.
Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, viva la revolución.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
Mao was born on December 26, 1893 in Hunan province, China. The thing that's really important to know about the time period in which Mao was born is that this was known as the century of humiliation in China, the 1800s. This was the century during which China was at one of its lowest points in history. Millions of people were starving in poverty. There were famines every other 5 years. And most importantly, the Western imperialists imposed the drug trade and drug influence on the Chinese people in what became known as the Two Opium Wars, in which the French, the British imperialists smuggled drugs. They planted drugs in India where they colonized. They grew poppy, and they exported it and brought it to China. And they forced the Chinese people to import this opium and drugged the entire country, impoverished it, stole all of their wealth, resources, labor. And China was in a very bad place. And even in a city like Shanghai at one point, which was controlled by the British, and Hong Kong as well, you had signs that said no Chinese or no dogs allowed on their own land. So China at this time was extremely downtrodden, oppressed, marginalized. And that is the context in which Mao was born in China. And Mao was a communist revolutionary who founded the People's Republic of China in 1949 until he passed away, sadly, in 1976. Mao was the son of a peasant family, working class family. And early on in his life, he was attracted to revolutionary politics. Initially, he was attracted to Bakunin and anarchism, and eventually seeing the successes of the Soviet Union, seeing the successes of Lenin and Stalin in particular, and the 5-year plans and industrialization, he was able to make the leap that I'm sure many of us have made as well, from kind of edgy, anarchisty teenager vibes to principled Marxist-Leninist scientific socialism, later on eventually supporting Chinese nationalism, but from a communist, proletarian nationalist perspective. And he was involved in many uprisings. I'm going to mispronounce this, by the way, my apologies to my Chinese comrades. The Shanghai Revolution of 1911, the May 4th movement of 1919. This is a time of great socialist upheaval all around the world, led by the socialist movements. And you had these nationalist movements that were rising as well, fighting imperialism, fighting the Western colonizers. And basically, Mao adopted Marxism-Leninism while he was working at Peking University as a librarian, and eventually became a founding member of the Communist Party of China, the CCP, and participated in the Autumn Harvest Uprising of 1927. This is after the establishment of the Soviet Union, and this is the peak, the height of communist uprisings in the East in particular. And one thing that's interesting about Mao during this time period is that at the time, there was a Trotskyist faction of the Chinese Communist Party that was dominant in China. And they held the view that Trotsky had of permanent revolution, that we have to wait until Western Europe has a revolution. We have to wait on Germany and England. And the revolution will not come from the peasants in the countryside. It can only come from the industrial proletarian. Mao flipped this and he said, no, we can begin building socialism in one country, just as Stalin was able to in the Soviet Union, and begin to organize the peasants, organize the masses in the countryside, which at that time was seen as heretical by some of the puritanical Trotskyists who only focused on the urban proletarian. And this is how Mao really became extremely popular, extremely well liked, allying himself with the peasantry, allying himself with the most oppressed sectors of Chinese society. And at one point, the communists were temporarily allied with the Kuomintang party, the KMT, the Nationalist Party. They're kind of like bourgeois nationalists, but there was a left wing faction within that. Mao and the communists temporarily formed an alliance with them during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945. This is the height of Japanese imperialism. Japan was expanding all the way. China, which at that time, Manchuria, Korea, Philippines, they went as far down as Myanmar, or aka Burma. They were temporarily allied against Japanese imperialism. And eventually, once the World War II came to an end, once the Japanese imperialists were defeated, the contradiction once again surfaced. And from 1945 to 1949, you have the final offensive between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. And ultimately, with the leadership of Mao, with the leadership of Zhou Enlai and many others, Lin Biao, the communists were victorious. The communists liberated China, not only from imperialism, but also from bourgeois nationalism. The KMT, Kuomintang reactionaries were forced and to escape, and they fled to Taiwan, which is part of China, but the Taiwanese government, allied with the West, tries to claim itself as the Republic of China, as a separate entity. And so on 1949, the People's Republic of China was established, led by the Communist Party of China. And Mao did some really amazing things in these initial years. Land reform, millions and millions of acres of land were redistributed, taken, confiscated from the landlords who were run by the Western imperialists, who did not have the interests of the masses at heart, and redistributed to the peasants, to the working class. Drugs were eliminated from the country, opium, in a revolutionary way too, not in the way that we see in the West of criminalization, but in terms of treatment, sending doctors. You have people who are former opium addicts becoming scientists and all of these, and engineers and all of these amazing things. You had also eventually the construction, socialist construction, during the 1950s with the Great Leap Forward, industrializing. China is now the largest producer of steel in the world because of industrialization. The centralization of power, political power under the Communist Party of China. The Great Leap Forward was probably one of the biggest advances in human history at the time, that aimed to rapidly industrialize China. Again, going from 1800s, feudalism, opium, colonization, horrible, we talk about also as well Tibet, we talk about the Dalai Lamas, we talk about oppression, some of the most horrible atrocities that existed in China. And Mao and the Communist Party of China were able to advance and bring the Chinese people to the 20th century under socialism with some amazing work. And obviously, there were some mistakes along the way, even including Mao himself, and the Chinese people are the first to admit that. But overall, Mao was a positive, progressive force for the world. And in my opinion, I think Mao will go down in history as one of the most important figures of the 20th century. I think he'll go down with figures like, obviously, not saying I endorse him politically, but Alexander the Great or Napoleon. Mao's going to be somebody who's going to be, his name is going to be talked about for centuries moving forward because of his political vision, his action. He went from organizing a small communist group of 20 people in the basement of a women's college to now having not only the largest communist party in the world, but the largest political party in the world that is in the largest populated country in the world, leading the fastest industrialization, lifting more people out of poverty than ever in human history. So many amazing things about Chairman Mao, and that's why I have so much respect for him, and so does Comrade Josh. Comrade Josh, anything I'm missing here? I know there's obviously this is so much to cover, but anything that you think is important to mention related to Mao, his early life, the development, and some of the things you were mentioning before the stream.
Well, you did a great job, I will say, of laying a lot of the historical context down. It's difficult to really go over 50 to 100 plus years of, historical change and monumental ebbs and flows in blips. But I would say that you did a fantastic job. So, in kind of hitting on a lot of what you said, you have to when we're understanding what happened in China, the role that Mao himself played, and their own development of a socialist project, and really lay it as you did in the historical context, because as you said, for generations, the average person within China was going to be subject to extreme poverty. They were going to be subject to reoccurrent famines all throughout the 18 and 1900s. They were going to be subject to a lack of electrification. They were going to have to live in very rural, isolated areas, oftentimes without any forms of support, dominated by feudal warlords, landlords, and other just kind of mercenary type style living, in the sense that a lot of these feudal warlords went on to aid the Japanese imperialists as well as the U.S. imperialists later on in the years to come. But before I get too deep, I will say a few things. We have to understand in this context the revolutionary role of the masses, and how connecting to the masses was one of the most important things that Mao, or really any revolutionary, if we look across the globe, can really do. When Mao was young, he grew up in a very poor rural area, as you said, and he saw the suffering of the farmers, of the serfs, of the peasants, and he really actually, unlike what most folks were enduring, he had a somewhat steady lifestyle. He had a family that was feeding him, that had land, that had the ability to send him to school. And so having that framework, while also being able to develop educationally, while being able to see different parts of the Chinese environment, it really allowed, I think, Mao very early on to, as you said, take a dissatisfaction with the way things were going. He was obviously very angry about the way in which the average person was suffering. And so he, at the time, like you said, was a librarian and was really dedicated to reading philosophy. He read a lot of bourgeois philosophy. As you said, he got into Bakunin. He, for a period of time, enjoyed Kropotkin. But eventually, once he began to make his way towards folks like Marx, Engels, Lenin, he began to kind of see the qualitative difference in the analysis that they put out, the concrete, what we might call materialism, that was really branded differently than just about anything he had read. In the introductory course to Marxism-Leninism-Maoism that Foreign Language Press puts out, they give a little rundown of his life. And this is one of the most important points that he acknowledges in his life that made a qualitative change. Now, a lot of this came also from the period of time he was living in. Again, there was massive upheaval across the nation. There was all kind of different factions from which this was coming from. You mentioned the Trotskyists, you mentioned the Kuomintang, the KMT party. So you had kind of like a more bourgeois nationalist and then a more petty bourgeois Trotskyist approach. And then you had, kind of your anarchist circles, and you had your Marxists, which Mao and few others were really heading the way. So, as you mentioned, in 1921, he was one of the founding members of the Communist Party. And in doing so, the approach that they were trying to take was they were trying to make available to the people a wholly different mentality, a wholly different concretization of their reality, because people were angry. They knew that. They knew that there was going to be change, but they also understood that in this way, if we actually want to resolve the issues that we're facing, rather than put temporary band-aid solutions or simply transition power to a different ruling class, we have to give the people the tools to be able to do so. As you mentioned, Mao, unlike some other Marxists, really saw the revolutionary necessity of the peasantry, of the poor, rural, and exploited people who really still to this day make up a significant majority within the Chinese population. And this is because, as we know, oftentimes colonized and imperialized nations are kept far behind in different realities because it is their exploitation and their suffering that benefits the imperialist core, such as Europe or the United States. So, just real quick, finishing up on this, with kind of getting an understanding of what was going on at the time that you had your early fights between the KMT and the communists, then into your Sino-Japanese War. You have a necessity for a deep understanding of the reality in order to make correct decisions in allegiances, in strategic, decision making, and all of that came from a deep connection and a deep base coming from the masses. Now, ultimately, it is very difficult to involve, poor rural folks in a lot of what we might consider organizing because of the exploitation and the suffering that they endure on a day-to-day basis. But in a lot of ways, what Mao and the communists did in the rural areas with land redistribution, it really made it so that this was actively engaged with, actively attacked. They did not simply resign themselves to a situation that, oh, well, these people are, suffering. How are we going to get them to get involved? No, the communists armed the people, they trained them, and they took the land in a way that was very similar to what happened in Russia, is very similar to what happened in Cuba, is very similar to what happens around the world when the people themselves take over because they realize we don't need some stupid referendum. We don't need a bunch of legislation to be passed. We need these people who are not using this land to get the fuck off. And we need people who know how to use land, who have been living on this land for generations, to be able to use this land to feed themselves and their community. And then they made that transition from land redistribution to collectivization, recognizing that, in fact, now that the people had begun to take private ownership of the land, they needed to avoid the small producer mentality that comes as capitalism is inserted and private property is upheld. Now, I heard an interview with Rev Left Radio from 2018 where this was discussed, and his guest mentioned that in some ways this was difficult because of the speed by which they had to make this transition from, a lot of these folks for the first time being able to privately own land to now being told that we have to collectivize everything. A lot of people who were not actively engaged with the party, who were still under, different spells from capitalist or bourgeois mentality, or even a more feudalist rural mentality, led to some distrust within the party. But ultimately, as we see today, with the Communist Party being millions strong, they have taken active approaches to solve these issues. But that's really the base that we need to be working with an understanding of the early history of China and its revolutionary project.
Well said. I think that's a great summary, and I'm sure Mao would have a lot to say now, especially with the evictions taking place, the moratorium on evictions coming to an end, and people being forced into homelessness, the increasing rise of unhoused people across the US and the world. And I think it's something that was brilliant about Mao is that he reached, there's that expression that Lenin says, lower and deeper. And I think Mao is somebody who really went to the most oppressed sectors of society. And it's no surprise that in a lot of movements around the world, the most oppressed sectors of society have been attracted to Mao and his politics because he wasn't somebody who was like a latte leftist, soy Trotskyist kind of type. He was somebody who was very working class, very revolutionary, and advocated for maintaining revolutionary discipline after the victory of the Communist Party or movement in a revolution. He says the revolution continues, the class struggle continues even after the communists take state power, which I think is really brilliant.